Hello folks, welcome back to the channel. So today we are trying to work out, is a 5600X too weak for a 4080 Super? So we did a video a while ago when I got my 5800X 3D and 4080 combo, and a lot of you asked, can you do the same thing but also put in your old 5600X into the system and run that with the 4080? So here we are, that's what we're doing. But obviously to compare and contrast, we need something to compare and contrast against. So on the left we've got our 5600X, and on the right we have the same benchmarks running on the 5800X 3D. So hopefully we can see how much performance we're leaving on the table by going with a weaker, more modest, more affordable 5600X. So this is Starfield, currently running in 1080p low. Now this isn't going to be a full-on CPU benchmark, but for the science we're going to include 1080p low, and then we'll also look at settings you're more likely to run, because honestly, if you're buying a 4080 Super, I don't know why you'd be running at 1080p low. So now we're running at 1080p Ultra in Starfield. And as you can see, there's really not a lot in it when we're running at 1080p Ultra. There was, of course, when we were at 1080p low. You can see in both instances, the GPU is cranked at kind of 98 and 99% using similar wattages. So it seems that even at 1080p Ultra, we're kind of got a bit of a GPU bottleneck going on, it seems. Running at 1440p obviously shows a similar story. If it's going to GPU bottleneck at 1080p, it's certainly going to GPU bottleneck at 1440p. Of course, we're not using any DLSS in the 1080p or this 1440p demo. So maybe that's the next thing to try, because I kind of feel like this video is about settings that you're most likely to run. We're not kind of doing a full-on deep dive into the 5600X versus 5800X 3D. We know by this point in time that the 5800X 3D is the better chip. However, what this video is trying to do is figure out, if you do have a 5600X in your build or a similar style of CPU, are you going to be basically wasting your money by putting a giant 4080 Super next to it? So let's put on DLSS and see if that lets the GPU stretch its legs a little bit more. Okay, so now we're running at 1440p ultra quality with DLSS quality mode on, and here you can see the 5800X 3D is now letting our GPU do a little bit more work. Look at the 5600X there on the left. You see the GPU usage is down around 80-ish%, and our average FPS is kind of 79, 80 FPS, whereas with the 5800X 3D, that's allowing our GPU, because obviously DLSS is enabled, the GPU can stretch its legs a bit more, and we're getting nearer to 100 FPS on the averages, and also the 1% lows and 0.1% lows are higher too. Okay, moving on up to 4K Ultra, and much like we saw with 1080p Ultra and 1440p Ultra, it's a GPU limitation all the way here. Pretty much identical, even down to the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. So what happens if we chuck on some DLSS? Is there a difference even at 4K with DLSS? So it would seem there is a difference at 4K Ultra with DLSS on quality. Not by huge amounts, we're only talking 10, 15 FPS on the averages. But again, look at those 1% lows and 0.1% lows. Nice and nice difference there on the 5800X 3D. And those are the ones I kind of like to pay attention to, because you can have a lovely high average, but that can hide a lot. It's the 1% lows and especially the 0.1% lows that kind of are indicative of, are you getting a good experience? Does it feel weird? Does it feel juddery? So it's important to pay attention to those numbers. But again, you could, I suppose, see an even bigger difference if you were willing to drop DLSS down to performance or ultra performance. I personally like quality. That's kind of my minimum bar that I'm willing to go to. Now, over to Forza Horizon 5, and we are starting with 1080p low, and of course you can see here that the 5800X 3D on the averages is almost, what, 70 FPS higher, so that's a really good result. Again, 1%, 0.1% lows, nice and high across the board. That CPU is clearly being put to work and allowing the GPU to put out an awful lot more frames than the 5600X is allowing. But again, why would you buy a 4080 Super and then run it at 1080p low? That would just be weird. So let's try 1080p Ultra, and the differences aren't huge, if I'm being honest. What are we looking at here on the averages? What, 10 FPS more, maybe 12 FPS on the 1% lows, and 7 FPS on the 0.1% lows. So Forza Horizon 5, I don't know, if you're going to be running it at settings that you're kind of realistic settings. Again, you've bought a 4080 Super or similar card, you're going to want to crank things up. That's like the whole point, right? You're not going to be running it at 1080p low. So if you do have a more modest CPU, then you're still going to get a great experience with that, I think, in Forza Horizon 5. Again, we can see the averages starting to break away on the 5800X 3D, getting up nearer to 200 than the kind of 173 that we're seeing on the 5600X. But again, that's still a really respectable FPS number there from the 5600X. So let's see how things fare in 1440p and 4K. Okay, so running in 1440p Ultra mode, and again, we're not using any DLSS. This is all raw performance here on all the Forza Horizon 5 benchmarks so far. Yeah, 5800X 3D, it's a little bit better, but not by loads. But again, are you going to get a bad experience with a 4080 Super and a 5600X on Forza Horizon 5? No, probably not. Could you get a better experience with a 5800X 3D? Yeah, but is it worth that extra money? On the average, is there another 15 FPS? Is that worth upgrading from a 5600X to a 5800X 3D? No, probably not. So, moving up to 4K in Forza Horizon 5, you can see that the 5800X 3D is allowing the 4080 to stretch its legs just a little bit more, even at 4K. Not by huge amounts. The kind of 0.1% lows are a nice bit higher, as are the 1% lows. But, you know, it's not going to be terrible if you're running a 5600X and you put a big card like a 4080 Super with it. You're not going to get a terrible result there at all. You're not leaving too much on the table in Forza Horizon 5 at least. Okay, so a new title, Grey Zone Warfare, which is on the Unreal 5 engine. Now this is at 1080p low, and I had to double check these numbers because I was like, surely like the 5800X 3D can't be that much better, because you know we're well into triple figures here on the X3D, but on the 5600X we are barely getting above 80 FPS. Apologies, the FPS numbers are a bit weird. I messed up when I was benchmarking. I didn't scale them properly as I was moving through the resolution, so that's my bad. But this is 1080p low, but this game is, you know, a real looker. So let's see what happens when we go to 1080p Ultra. So moving on up into Ultra mode, and you can see now that the differences are narrowing a little bit, although the 5800X 3D is substantially ahead still. And look at that GPU usage on the 5600X, we're kind of in the 70s, in the 80s, whereas over on the 5800X 3D, that 4080 Super is allowing itself to work a little bit harder to get those higher FPS numbers. So clearly the CPU is having an impact here. Let's see what happens when we go over to 1440p Ultra, see if that gap narrows even further. So now we're running at 1440p on the Epic preset. If I said Ultra on the 1080p, I meant Epic. It's all running at Epic, if not at low. You can see here that the gap has narrowed between the 5600X and 5800X 3D. So I'm curious as to whether DLSS is going to start to play a role at this point, because obviously we're not running DLSS. Kind of feel like this game is probably going to need all the bells and whistles like DLSS that you can throw at it, because, you know, 1440p, we're not much beyond 60 FPS really, are we? So this game's going to need all the help it can get. Let's turn on DLSS onto quality mode, and there we go. Now you can see that the 5800X 3D is now breaking into the triple figure mark, now into sort of 100 plus FPS on the averages, and the 1% lows sort of in the high 70s, which is a good result there. Good result indeed. So clearly a CPU limitation is present on this game, and a 5800X 3D does allow your GPU, a big GPU like this, to work a lot harder than it otherwise would. Maybe if we were running something like a 3070, we'd be hitting a GPU limit a lot sooner, making the CPU differences here less relevant. Okay, now we're running at 4K Epic quality with DLSS set to quality. I wasn't even going to entertain putting just native 4K into this video at Epic quality. I did run it kind of off camera, but like we were in the 40s and it was kind of a pointless exercise. But you can see that the gaps here are quite narrow, because I think in both instances the GPU is getting a fairly good workout, although looking at the 5800X 3D, it is just able to let that GPU push a little bit further, getting us sort of into the mid to high 70s as opposed to the high 60s. But again, not huge amounts in it at 4K, even with DLSS, but kind of to be expected even with DLSS at 4K. All right, over to Diablo 4. Sorry that it looks weird. For whatever reason, when I tried to run any resolution that wasn't my panel's native resolution, it chucked it into windowed mode, and frankly, I didn't have time to debug it. So we're going to have to run in this weird windowed mode, but this is 1080p low, and you can see that the 5800X 3D is letting the GPU work way harder, and we're getting a significant bigger number of frames, you know, over 100 FPS more nearly on the averages. But you've kind of got to ask, even with the 5600X, do you even need 268 FPS in Diablo 4? I don't know. Let's move over to Ultra and see what it's like. So this is Ultra with no ray tracing and no DLSS, just plain old Ultra, and you can see that the 5800X 3D, even at 1080p Ultra, is allowing us to get a good bunch more frames, up near 330 on the averages as opposed to 260, and the 1% lows up above 200 FPS as opposed to hovering around like the 140, high 140s that we're seeing here on the 5600X. So a more stable experience, that's for sure, but nevertheless a really good showing from the 5600X. But again, it kind of proves the point that you are being held back on the GPU with this lower powered CPU. Okay, I'm going to have to not include any 1440p data because all my footage got corrupted for that, so yay. But this is running at 4K Ultra Ray Tracing mode with DLSS set to quality. Seriously, without DLSS, this was just a horrible mess, so you definitely want DLSS enabled. But you can see the averages are a little bit higher over on the 5800X 3D, but weirdly, the 1% lows are lower, and this remains consistent throughout. I don't know whether that's because the benchmark runs seem to be at a slightly different time of day on the 5800X 3D. Diablo 4 is a tricky one to benchmark. It seemed like every time I loaded the game, the time of day was different, even though I'm running around in the town to try and keep some consistency. This one is definitely not without its flaws. So moving over to Cyberpunk, we will start with the built-in benchmark. This is 1080p on the low preset, so you can see the 5800X 3D letting that GPU work a lot harder. So, you know, yes, basically, 5600X will hold you back in Cyberpunk, but by how much? I mean, we're already at 150 FPS on the averages. Do you need to go to 200? Maybe. We are at 1080p low after all, so again, I don't think this is a real kind of real-world situation. If you're going to buy a 4080 Super and then run at 1080p low, I think you should probably have a bit of a word with yourself. So let's crank it up to Ultra and see what happens. Okay, we are now in the Ultra RT mode. So I was interested to do Ultra RT because I know that ray tracing can also put a load on your CPU as well as your GPU. So this is 1080p Ultra RT, and you can see the 5600X. We're kind of around the averages, around like the sort of mid to low 80s. Whereas look at that 5800X 3D, that is plowing ahead well into the 120s, nice and high. So you know, that's quite a different gaming experience. You're now sort of into 120 FPS territory, really, on the 5800X 3D, whereas on the 5600X, it's kind of like you're in this weird middle ground between 60 FPS and 120. So, yeah, definite good result there for the 5800X 3D. Let's move into 1440p and see if that gap narrows. So even at 1440p, you can see the 5800X 3D is definitely seeing an advantage here. It's letting that GPU work an awful lot harder. Look at the GPU usage, 97, 96% over on the 5800X 3D, whereas the 5600X is keeping that GPU sort of well below 75-ish%. So clearly the stronger CPU really does help here, and you would be leaving quite a lot of performance on the table if you were to go with a more modest CPU paired with a GPU like this. So up into 4K now, and we're running at the same setting. It's the Ultra RT preset. I haven't fiddled with anything, so it's just the out-of-the-box settings here. And now we're at 4K. You can see that the CPU differences, although they are still present, they are not as pronounced, let's say. We're, in both cases, we're at sort of averages within like 75-ish, you know. Okay, maybe 3 FPS more on the 5800X 3D, but it's really not a lot. The 1% lows are a little bit higher over on the 5800X 3D. Quite a nice bit higher, actually, about what we're looking at, 15 FPS there. So that's not a bad result. And 0.1% lows, we've got another 10 or 12 FPS on top of that. So yeah, it is a better result on the 5800X 3D, but it's not by miles like we saw in the prior examples. So I figured we'd also do some benchmarking just in the game. This isn't going to be perfect because of course you're going to get run-to-run differences, but this is at 1080p low, and you can see in-game wandering around here in the city. 5800X 3D gives a much better experience at 1080p low, but again, you should be running at 1080p low if you've got a 4080 Super or similar card. So let's crank it up to the Ultra RT preset and see how it fares. Okay, now we're at 1080p Ultra RT, and that is a staggering difference. You know, we are well into triple figures with the averages, and barely breaking above 60 FPS on the 5600X. So that is quite a stark contrast, I would say. That GPU in this kind of real world game environment where you got lots of NPCs running around, lots going on in the city, that 5800X 3D is definitely being put to work here. Look how the GPU still isn't like maxed out at 90 odd % or anything, but the differences there were sort of 68, 69, 70, much better. Moving, I would say they are still pretty significant. Again, we're into triple figures on the averages just, whereas again we're kind of flirting with 60 FPS on the 5600X. We're almost at 70, but I see a 6 there and I'm like, eh. So yeah, definitely the 5800X 3D is earning its money here in Cyberpunk in the game. So now we're into 4K Ultra RT, and much like we saw with the benchmark, the gaps here are very, very low. We're sort of within 5 FPS of most of the different things, the averages, the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. So again, it's that same old story really. At 4K, yes, the 5800X 3D probably is better, but really it's not by loads. I don't think you're going to be leaving huge amounts on the table. You're probably going to get a more stable experience, but I think really at kind of 1080p, 1440p, especially at the ultra presets, you're going to see the difference. At 4K, it's going to narrow quite substantially. Okay, so this is going to be a fun one, Counter-Strike 2. Interestingly, this map that we're on only released like a couple of days ago, I think, at the time of recording this. So it's really fortunate timing from that point of view, because it's quite a difficult one to benchmark otherwise. So the developers of this map say that basically everything that's going on here is kind of what you would expect to see in a match, different kind of smoke grenades going off, fire grenades, all different sorts of things happening on the map as we fly around it. The 5600X is obviously putting in a good result at almost 500 FPS, but then the 5800X 3D showing that there is more that can be done, heading on up into like nearly the 650s, and the lows are a nice bit higher as well. So this is at 1080p low. What we're going to do next, we're going to run through the resolutions, but we're going to do so using competitive settings, the kind of settings that if you're actually a CS2 player and you've got some serious hardware, the settings that you might end up with, because I think it's kind of looked upon poorly to run at ultra because, for competitive integrity and so on and so forth. So let's see what it's like. 1080p at competitive settings. So at 1080p competitive, we're still 428 FPS on average, even from the 5600X. That's still a really huge amount. I don't know, some people obsess over this stuff when it comes into like Counter-Strike and Valorant and Rainbow Six Siege and so on and so forth. I think the big takeaway for me here is that the lows are higher. That's kind of where I would see the 5800X 3D having the advantage, not necessarily the ridiculously high averages, but it's just those more stable lows. Let's go up to 1440p and see if there are any differences. So kicking off into 1440p, and you can see that kind of difference is still there between the averages on both chips. Notice how the GPU limit is starting to come into play here as well on the 5800X 3D. You see sometimes we're getting up into the 98, 99% on it there, 100% there, just as we flew through that smoke grenade. Whereas the 5600X isn't allowing that to happen. We're staying much lower. So again, it's like those 1% lows are nice and high on the 5800X 3D, although the 0.1% lows do seem quite similar. So that's kind of a good mark, I suppose, for the 5600X. Again, these are all super high numbers that we're dealing with here. And I know people get quite obsessive over this stuff with Counter-Strike. Truthfully, probably 90% of those that do, probably it makes no difference because they're just not good enough anyway. But let's not start a fight. Let's move on to 4K. All right, moving up to 4K then, and this is still at the competitive setting, and let's just let this flash grenade come through, and yeah, okay, so we're more similarly matched at 4K. Again, the 5800X 3D is a little bit faster, a little bit, that 1% low, there seems to be like a dip there of like, on the 0.1% lows on the 5600X that the 5800X 3D didn't seem to get. I think I noticed it on the prior benchmarks as well. Go back and check if I'm right or not. But again, I think at 4K, much like we've seen with other titles, yes, okay, there probably is going to be a small difference going from 5600X to 5800X 3D, but it's not going to be nearly as much as what we see at 1080p and 1440p. Okay, moving on to Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, this game is notoriously CPU limited. We are running